In 1944, German reconnaissance looked across the line and saw an American armored division. Tanks parked in the tree line, trucks moving on the roads, the crackle of radio traffic between units, soldiers in a nearby town wearing the division's patches, talking in the cafes. Everything checked out. Except almost none of it was real. The tanks were rubber, the radio chatter was scripted, and the division of tens of thousands of men was in fact around 1,100 soldiers, most of them artists. This was the Ghost Army, and its weapon was not firepower, it was illusion. Over the course of the war, they would impersonate divisions more than 20 times, often just a few hundred meters from an enemy who could have wiped them out in an afternoon. The unit was officially the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, activated on the 20th of January 1944 at Camp Forest in Tennessee, under the command of Colonel Harry Reeder. The concept had come from officers like Ralph Ingersoll and Billy Harris, who had studied how the British fooled the Germans in the North African desert. At El Alamein in 1942, in an operation called Bertram, the British had used dummy tanks, fake supply dumps, and misdirection to disguise where and when they would strike. If deception could work in the desert, it could work in Europe. So the US Army built something new, a traveling unit designed for one purpose: to lie convincingly, at scale, on the battlefield, and make the enemy defend against armies that were not there. Who do you recruit to invent a war? The answer, it turned out, was artists. The Ghost Army pulled in painters, designers, illustrators, architects and sound engineers, many straight out of art schools and advertising studios. Among them were men who would become famous names in peacetime, like the fashion designer Bill Blass, the painter Ellsworth Kelly, and the photographer Art Kane. They were, by the standards of the Army, an unusually creative and highly intelligent group. In total, the unit was small, only around 1,100 men, and they trained in secrecy to learn a craft the Army had never formally taught: how to be believed. But this was not a single band of artists. It was a machine with 4 specialized parts, each responsible for a different kind of lie. The first part was sight. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers handled the most photographed side of the work, the inflatable army. Rubber tanks, trucks, jeeps and artillery pieces, a dummy tank weighing under 100 pounds that a few men could carry and inflate by hand. From a distance or from the air, they looked like the real thing. The camouflage men would set them out, sometimes deliberately hiding them just badly enough that German reconnaissance would catch a glimpse and report a build-up of forces exactly where the Ghost Army wanted the enemy looking. They even mastered small, imperfect details, tracks in the mud, tarps thrown over the shapes so the lie would survive a second look. The dummies themselves were manufactured back home by rubber companies. Ordinary peacetime industry now turned to building a war that wasn't there. But sight was only part of it. A second unit, the 3132nd Signal Service Company, carried sound. Their equipment grew out of recordings, and technology developed with engineers from Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, and trained at a secret site that is now Fort Drum. They captured the noises of real armored and infantry units, the clank of tank tracks, the rumble of trucks, the hammering of men building a bridge, and mixed them into convincing soundscapes on vinyl records. Each sound was carefully layered and mixed, so that a listener would hear not a single loud noise, but the complex, believable texture of a whole force on the move. These records were played through enormous 500-pound speakers mounted on half-tracks, loud enough to be heard from around 15 miles away. In the dark, an enemy could hear an entire armored column assembling, engines and tracks and shouted orders that did not exist. The third layer was the airwaves. The signal company special ran what they called spoof radio. Operators would imitate the exact keying style and habits of real units' radio men, keeping phantom divisions chattering on the air as if they were really there. And the fourth technique they simply called atmosphere. Soldiers would drive into nearby towns wearing the insignia of the units they were impersonating, painting false markings on their vehicles, sewing on the right patches, letting themselves be seen and overheard in bars and cafes. The whole illusion was built in layers, so that whichever way the enemy checked, by sight, by sound, or by signals, the story held together. It is easy to make this sound like a game. It was not. A fourth element, drawn from the 406th Engineer Combat Company, provided what little security they had, but these men operated close to the front, with almost no heavy weapons of their own. Their entire protection was the lie. If the enemy ever saw through it and attacked in force, there was very little they could do but run. Over the course of the war, the unit had 3 men killed and around 30 wounded. The illusion was real work, done in real range of real guns, and it carried a real risk. They got their first real test not long after arriving in Europe in August 1944 in the fighting around the port of Brest in Brittany. It was one of their earliest combined operations, and it was a hard, sobering introduction to how close to genuine danger this strange job would take them. One of their most important jobs came in September 1944, near Bettembourg in Luxembourg. General Patton's line had a dangerous gap, a stretch he reportedly described as one rather bad spot in my line. The Ghost Army was sent to fill it, not with soldiers, but with the impression of soldiers holding a thinly defended piece of front by making the Germans believe a strong armored force was dug in there. For about a week, from the 15th to the 22nd of September, a small group of men with rubber tanks, sound and radio stood in for a defense that did not really exist, buying time until real units could arrive. It was the longest single operation they ever ran. The impersonation, according to accounts from the men, could be nerve-wracking in its own right. They had to keep the act going in the towns and on the roads, always alert to the danger that a passing real soldier or a sharp-eyed local might notice that something about this division did not quite add up. That winter, during the German offensive in the Ardennes, elements of the unit were also used for radio deception in an operation known as Kodak, helping to mask the movement and strength of American forces in a chaotic, dangerous moment. But their largest deception of all came in March 1945, on the Rhine. In Operation Viersen, from the 18th to the 24th, the Ghost Army faked an entire river crossing about 10 miles away from where the real US 9th Army intended to cross. They simulated the build-up of roughly 2 divisions, some 40,000 men, using more than 600 dummies, along with the sound and radio traffic to match, and fake command posts and headquarters to complete the picture. The goal was to pull German attention and firepower toward the Phantom Crossing. When the real crossing came, it met far lighter resistance than it might otherwise have faced. It was, by any measure, their masterpiece. So how much did the illusion matter? This is where honesty is important. You will often see figures claiming the Ghost Army saved 15 to 30,000 lives. Those numbers are estimates, not measurements. By its nature, you cannot count the casualties that never happened. The unit's official historians tend to use a more careful word, thousands, but the men themselves knew what they had achieved. The unit's own after-action report, classified for decades, put it plainly. Rarely, it said, had there been a group of so few men who had so great an influence on the outcome of a major campaign. That is a careful, honest claim, and it is enough. Drawing the enemy toward armies of rubber and sound meant that again and again, fewer real soldiers had to walk into fire. Whether the true figure was in the low thousands or higher, every one of those saved lives was a person who went home. And then, for half a century, almost no one knew. The Ghost Army's work was classified. The men went home and simply could not talk about what they had done. It was only by the mid-1990s, roughly half a century later, that the records were finally released and the story could begin to be told in public. For decades, some of the most creative soldiers of the war carried a secret they were not allowed to share, even with their own wives and children, watching other units take the credit for battles their illusions had helped to shape. Some of them died before they could ever explain where they had really been, or what they had really done in those years. In 2022, the United States finally acted, signing a law to award the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor. And in 2024, the last surviving veterans, by then around 100 years old, received it in person. It is tempting to file this under clever war stories, but there is something deeper in it. Here was a unit that understood that winning did not always mean charging a hill. Sometimes it meant being clever enough that fewer people had to die at all. A war fought with paintbrushes, loudspeakers, and rubber by men who were told to keep quiet about it for 50 years. They were not the soldiers of the posters or the newsreels. They were artists and engineers who won their battles by being believed and then went home and said nothing. It took their country the better part of 80 years to say out loud what they had done, and by the time it did, almost all of them were gone. That is the front that history forgets. That is why we tell it.